In a makeshift hangar on the northern edge of Australia, under the oppressive heat of early March 1943, a captain in the United States Army Air Force was about to commit what could reasonably be called a career-ending act of insubordination. The bomber sitting before him bore modifications that no manual authorized, no superior officer had signed off on, and no aircraft designer had ever intended. Where the glazed bombardier's nose should have been, 8 heavy machine guns jutted forward like the fangs of some mechanical predator. This was no ordinary B-25 Mitchell. This was a weapon born from rage, grief, and the kind of desperate innovation that emerges when men who know how things work decide that the rules no longer apply. The man responsible for this transformation was 43 years old, exhausted, and fighting a war that had become intensely personal. His name was Paul Irvin Gunn, though nobody called him Pappy yet, and somewhere in the occupied Philippines, his wife and 4 children were prisoners of the Japanese Empire. Every rivet he drove, every gun he mounted, every modification he welded onto these bombers was an act of vengeance disguised as military necessity. What Gunn couldn't have known as he stood there with oil under his fingernails and fury in his chest was that his unauthorized tinkering would precipitate the most catastrophic naval defeat Japan would experience in the entire Pacific theater. The rules he was breaking would save thousands of Allied lives and fundamentally alter how air forces thought about attacking ships. The weapon he was creating would terrorize an empire. The path to this moment stretched back to December 8, 1941, Manila time, when Gunn stood on the tarmac at Nichols Field watching Japanese bombers methodically obliterate American air power in the Philippines. At that point, Gunn was just the manager of Philippine Airlines, responsible for 4 Beech 18 civilian aircraft that suddenly became very interesting to Major General Louis Brereton, who commandeered them immediately and commissioned Gunn on the spot as a captain. What began as what should have been temporary wartime service evolved into something much darker. Gunn was 42, a veteran of 20 years as an enlisted naval aviator who had retired from the Navy in December 1939. He had learned aviation in the 1920s, flown with the Top Hatters fighter squadron, instructed at Pensacola, and accumulated the kind of hands-on knowledge that comes from actually fixing things when they break rather than reading about them in textbooks. He understood aircraft at a fundamental level, the way a lifelong mechanic understands engines, through thousands of hours of direct contact. But technical expertise meant nothing when his family was trapped in a city about to fall. His wife Clara Louise, universally known as Polly, and their 4 children were in Manila as Japanese forces closed in from every direction. The boys, Paul Jr. and Nathan, were teenagers. The daughters, Connie and Julie, were younger. They had been living the comfortable expatriate life that evaporated in a matter of hours. During the chaotic weeks following the invasion, Gunn flew whatever missions needed flying. Reconnaissance sorties over collapsing defensive lines, transport runs dodging Japanese fighters. He survived being shot down in the jungle, walked back to Allied lines, and climbed into another aircraft the same day. On one particularly audacious mission, he earned a Distinguished Flying Cross by piloting an unarmed transport into Bataan to deliver medical supplies to besieged American troops, navigating through Japanese-controlled airspace through sheer skill and nerves of steel. But none of it brought him closer to his family. On Christmas Eve, 1941, orders came down to evacuate key personnel to Australia. Gunn withdrew all his military pay, borrowed every dollar he could from fellow officers, and made frantic preparations to evacuate his family. The Japanese advance moved too quickly. His family couldn't reach the airfield. Gunn faced an impossible choice between staying and dying or leaving and surviving to fight. He chose to follow orders because orders were orders, because individual lives had to be subordinated to the larger war effort, because staying meant capture or death. He flew to Australia. On January 20th, 1942, Polly and the children were rounded up by Japanese occupation forces and interned at the University of Santo Tomas, converted overnight into a civilian prison camp. Something fundamental broke in Gunn when he received this news. The man who continued fighting was not the same person who had departed Manila. He had abandoned his wife and 4 children to an enemy notorious for brutality toward prisoners. Every morning they remained in that camp was another morning Gunn couldn't protect them, couldn't even know if they were alive. The only action available to him was ending the war as quickly as possible. If he couldn't rescue his family directly, he could destroy every ship, every aircraft, every supply convoy that sustained Japanese forces in the Philippines. This wasn't military strategy. This was personal vendetta wrapped in military necessity. When Major General George Kenney arrived in Brisbane in late July 1942 to assume command of Allied Air Force's Southwest Pacific area, he inherited a disaster. His predecessor had been relieved for incompetence. Morale was abysmal. Equipment was inadequate and poorly maintained. The Japanese controlled the skies over New Guinea and were actively threatening Australia. General Douglas MacArthur, the theatre commander, had zero confidence in his air forces and wasn't subtle about expressing that opinion. Kenney was 53, a World War I fighter ace with 2 confirmed kills and a Silver Star who had taught at the Air Corps Tactical School. He had a reputation for unconventional thinking. When MacArthur subjected him to an hour-long tirade about the inadequacies of Allied air power, Kenney listened politely and then asked for just one thing: authority to relieve anyone he considered incompetent. MacArthur, somewhat surprised, agreed. Within weeks, Kenney had ruthlessly reorganized his command structure, promoted aggressive younger officers, and established a forward headquarters in New Guinea to eliminate the delays inherent in waiting for decisions from Brisbane. He appointed Brigadier General Ennis Whitehead as his forward commander with authority to modify missions based on immediate tactical conditions, rather than waiting for orders from rear echelon headquarters. But personnel changes accomplished nothing without effective weapons. Allied bombing from medium and high altitudes was proving catastrophically ineffective against Japanese shipping. High-altitude attacks gave ships time to maneuver. The vaunted B-17 flying fortresses were hitting less than 1% of their targets. Japanese convoys were resupplying their garrisons in New Guinea with impunity, while Allied ground forces died in the jungle. Kenney had been thinking about this problem since 1928, when he was an instructor at the tactical school. He had theorized about skip bombing, the concept of releasing bombs at extremely low altitude so they would skip across the water surface like flat stones, slamming into ship hulls below the waterline where armor protection was weakest. The physics were sound. The execution was proving nightmarishly difficult. B-17s lacked forward-firing weapons. Approaching at mast height meant flying through concentrated anti-aircraft fire with no ability to suppress the gunners. Then Kenney discovered Paul Gunn, and the equation changed completely. In August 1942, Kenney learned that someone in the 3rd Attack Group was modifying a 20 Havoc light bombers without authorization. The modifications were crude, but showed promise. Someone had removed the bombardier from the transparent nose section and installed 450 caliber machine guns pointing forward, all under the pilot's control. The concept was to strafe Japanese positions at extremely low altitude, suppressing ground fire immediately before dropping bombs. Kenney investigated and found Captain Paul Gunn essentially working alone, scavenging weapons from wrecked fighters and mounting them in attack aircraft using improvised brackets. Gunn had taught himself aircraft modification through pure trial and error. He possessed no formal engineering degree, but he understood aircraft structures, weight distribution, and weapons integration from 20 years of hands-on work. Most officers would have court-martialed Gunn for unauthorized modification of military aircraft. Kenney immediately assigned him to his personal staff as a special projects officer and gave him an impossible deadline. Modify every A-20 in the theatre for low-altitude attack and do it immediately. Gunn worked 18-hour days, 7 days a week. He scrounged weapons from crashed aircraft, fabricated mounting brackets in improvised workshops, and personally test flew every modification to ensure it worked. He added 4 50 caliber machine guns to each A-20's nose, mounted additional guns along the fuselage, and installed bomb racks for parachute fragmentation bombs designed to explode above ground level. The modified A-20s entered combat in September 1942, striking a Japanese airfield at Buna. The results exceeded every expectation. The Strafe A-20s approached at treetop level with all guns firing, suppressing anti-aircraft positions before releasing bombs. Japanese defenders, accustomed to high-altitude bombers they could see approaching for minutes, had no time to react to aircraft that appeared suddenly at 200 feet, traveling 300 miles per hour. The attack obliterated dozens of aircraft on the ground and proved conclusively that low-level strafing could revolutionize air-to-ground warfare. Kenny immediately ordered Gunn to begin equivalent modifications on B-25 Mitchell medium bombers. The B-25 was larger than the A-20, possessed longer range, carried heavier bomb loads, and could accommodate more forward-firing weapons. If Gunn could transform the Mitchell into a gunship, it would become the most lethal anti-shipping weapon in the theatre. The B-25 Mitchell had been designed in 1939 as a medium-altitude level bomber. Twin Wright R-2600 radial engines producing 1,700 horsepower each powered the aircraft. Normal wingspan measured 67 feet 7 inches. Standard armament consisted of 650 caliber machine guns for defensive purposes and 3,000 pounds of bombs. Crew complement was 5, pilot, co-pilot, bombardier, radio operator and gunner. The aircraft bore the name of General Billy Mitchell, the controversial air power advocate who had been court-martialed in 1925 for publicly criticizing military leadership. Approximately 9,890 B-25s would eventually roll off production lines at 2 North American aviation plants, one in Inglewood, California, another in Kansas City, Kansas. The B-25 had achieved fame in April 1942 when Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle led 16 B-25Bs on an audacious raid against Tokyo, launching from the aircraft carrier Hornet. The raid inflicted minimal physical damage but provided an enormous psychological boost to Americans still reeling from Pearl Harbor. More significantly, it forced Japan to retain fighter aircraft for homeland defense rather than deploying them to frontline areas. But the B-25's primary mission remained medium-altitude bombing, a role at which it was proving spectacularly ineffective against naval targets. Gunn examined the B-25 and recognized potential nobody else saw. The nose section was large enough to accommodate multiple heavy machine guns. The twin-engine configuration provided redundancy if one engine failed. The robust construction could absorb significant battle damage. Most critically, the Mitchell possessed sufficient range to reach Japanese shipping lanes beyond the capability of the shorter-range A-20. In late 1942, Gunn established a modification facility in a maintenance hangar at Townsville, Australia, working with Captain Jack Fox, the North American aviation technical representative in theatre. Fox was theoretically supposed to ensure all aircraft modifications followed factory specifications. Instead, he became Gunn's co-conspirator in what would evolve into the most successful unauthorized aircraft modification program of the war. The initial challenge involved removing the bombardier and his glass nose section. This eliminated a vulnerable crew position and saved weight. Gunn replaced the nose with a solid metal section housing 4 50 caliber machine guns. He added 2 more 50 caliber guns in cheek blisters on either side of the forward fuselage just below and behind the cockpit. These package guns extended slightly beyond the propeller arc, allowing them to fire without bullets passing through the propeller disc. They were fixed rigidly, firing straight ahead, adding to the pilot's firepower. Then Gunn made a radical decision. The B-25 featured a dorsal turret with twin 50 caliber guns mounted behind the cockpit. This turret normally rotated to defend against attacks from above and behind. Gunn locked the turret facing forward, adding 2 more guns to the pilot's control. The co-pilot could operate these guns using a sight in the cockpit, or the pilot could fire all weapons simultaneously using a master trigger. The modified B-25 now mounted 8 forward-firing 50 caliber machine guns, delivering approximately 180 pounds of projectiles per second. For comparison, a single P-51 Mustang fighter carried 6 50 caliber guns. The modified B-25 possessed the forward firepower of more than one fighter aircraft concentrated in a platform that also transported 2,000 pounds of bombs. The modifications created significant engineering challenges. Adding mass to the nose shifted the aircraft's center of gravity forward, making it nose-heavy and difficult to control. Gunn compensated by repositioning equipment and adding ballast to the tail section. The enormous recoil from 8 guns firing simultaneously created structural stress. Gunn reinforced the nose section with additional bracing. The guns generated tremendous heat and smoke. Gunn added ventilation systems and relocated ammunition storage to reduce fire hazards. Most critically, Gunn had to solve gun harmonization. The 8 guns needed to converge their fire at a specific distance ahead of the aircraft, typically between 200 and 400 yards. If the guns weren't properly aligned, bullets would spray randomly rather than concentrating on the target. Gunn developed a ground testing procedure using targets placed at measured distances, meticulously adjusting each gun mount until all 8 weapons converged precisely. He personally test-fired the guns, making minute adjustments, refusing to approve any aircraft until it met his standards. The complete modification process consumed approximately 2 weeks per aircraft when working around the clock. Gunn trained maintenance crews to perform the work using production line techniques. By December 1942, he had modified sufficient B-25s to equip the 91st Bombardment Squadron. The squadron required a commander who understood low-altitude attack and wasn't constrained by conventional bombing doctrine. Kenny selected Major Ed Larner, a pilot who had risen from first lieutenant to major in weeks due to aggressive combat leadership. Larner had demonstrated exceptional skill in low-level missions and had earned Kenny's complete trust. Larner and Gunn collaboratively developed the tactics that would transform naval warfare. The modified B-25s would approach Japanese vessels at extremely low altitude, sometimes as low as 50 feet above the water, flying at maximum speed of approximately 300 miles per hour. At this altitude and speed, they were nearly impossible for ship gunners to track. The closing velocity was too fast for manual aiming, and the aircraft had already passed before gunners could adjust their fire. As the B-25s closed range, pilots would open fire with all 8 forward guns at approximately 1,000 yards, walking the concentrated fire into the target ship. The stream of 50 caliber bullets would sweep decks, killing or suppressing anti-aircraft crews, destroying gun positions, shredding superstructures, and creating absolute chaos. The purpose wasn't sinking the ship with gunfire alone, though the damage could be substantial. The purpose was silencing the ship's defenses and terrorizing the crew. Then came the bombs. At a range of approximately 200 to 400 yards while flying at minimum safe altitude, the pilot would release a bomb fitted with a 4 to 5 second delayed fuse. The bomb would exit the aircraft traveling 300 miles per hour, strike the water surface, and skip across it like a stone. The bomb would bounce once, perhaps twice, then slam into the ship's side at or below the waterline. The delayed fuse ensured the bomb didn't detonate on water impact. Instead, it would penetrate the hull, sink slightly below the surface, then explode. The detonation occurred in the ship's most vulnerable area, below the armor belt where hull plating was thinnest. The blast was amplified by water's incompressibility, which transmitted shockwaves with devastating efficiency. A single bomb exploding below the waterline could break a ship's keel, rupture fuel tanks, flood engine compartments, and cause catastrophic structural failure. By the time the bomb detonated, the B-25 had already passed the target and was climbing rapidly to avoid the blast and secondary explosions. The entire attack sequence from first gunshots to bomb release consumed approximately 10 seconds. Skip bombing wasn't entirely revolutionary. The British had experimented with the technique. Some American pilots had attempted it independently. But combining skip bombing with overwhelming forward firepower was Gunn's innovation. The strafer nose transformed the bomber into its own fighter escort, suppressing defenses before delivering bombs. This combination would prove utterly devastating. While Gunn was modifying aircraft, Allied intelligence was monitoring Japanese naval movements. Ultra Intercepts, the code-breaking operation that had cracked Japanese naval codes, provided detailed information about enemy intentions. Fleet Radio Unit Melbourne, known by the acronym FRUMEL, was reading Japanese messages almost in real time. In late February 1943, FRUMEL intercepted communications indicating a major Japanese convoy was assembling at Rabaul on the island of New Britain. The convoy's destination was Lae on New Guinea's northern coast. The cargo consisted of troops and supplies for Japanese forces fighting Allied advances in Papua. The intelligence was remarkably specific. 8 transport ships would carry approximately 6,900 troops from the 51st Division. 8 destroyers would provide escort. The convoy would depart Rabaul at midnight on February 28, 1943, arriving at Lae approximately 3 days later. This represented Japan's maximum effort to reinforce New Guinea. If the convoy succeeded, Japanese forces would be significantly strengthened, potentially halting Allied advances. If the convoy failed, Japan would lose thousands of experienced troops and likely never attempt another major sea reinforcement. General Kenny recognized an opportunity to test his modified aircraft and new tactics against the most critical target since Pearl Harbor. He assembled every available aircraft in theater for a coordinated assault. The strike force would include B-17 Flying Fortresses bombing from medium altitude, Royal Australian Air Force Bow fighters strafing at low level, P-38 Lightning fighters providing air cover, and modified B-25 strafers executing skip bombing attacks. It would constitute the largest coordinated air operation in the Southwest Pacific to date. Kenny personally briefed squadron commanders on February 28th. The orders were explicit and brutal. Find the convoy, attack without mercy, sink every ship. This wasn't a raid, this was annihilation. At midnight on February 28, 1943, the Japanese convoy departed Simpson Harbor at Rabaul. Rear Admiral Masatomi Kimura commanded from the destroyer Shirayuki. The convoy consisted of 8 cargo transports: Kyokusei Maru, Kembu Maru, Teiyo Maru, Nojima, Ayo Maru, Taimei Maru, Shinai Maru, and Oigawa Maru. 8 destroyers provided escort: Shirayuki, Asashio, Arashio, Tokitsukaze, Yukikaze, Uranami, Shikinami, and Asagumo. Approximately 100 Japanese Zero fighters would fly air cover during the voyage. The convoy represented the strongest force Japan had assembled for a resupply mission. Kimura anticipated losing ships. Every previous convoy to New Guinea had suffered losses. But Japanese commanders believed sufficient ships would survive to deliver the troops. They were catastrophically wrong. The convoy was spotted that afternoon by a B-24 Liberator on routine patrol. The crew radioed position, course, and composition. Kenny's headquarters immediately launched reconnaissance aircraft to maintain contact. Weather initially favored the Japanese. 2 tropical storms moved through the area, providing cloud cover and reducing visibility. Allied aircraft maintained contact but couldn't attack effectively through the storms. The convoy made satisfactory progress, moving at 7 knots, approximately 8 miles per hour. The slow speed was dictated by the heavily loaded transports. The destroyers could have achieved 20 knots or more, but they had to match the convoy's pace. By nightfall on March 1st, the Japanese had covered approximately 90 miles, roughly halfway to Lae. Weather was deteriorating, which Kimura welcomed. Poor weather meant fewer Allied aircraft. But the storms also generated rough seas that pounded the transports. Troops below decks suffered terribly from seasickness in the overcrowded holds. On the morning of March 2nd, 1943, weather improved slightly. Allied reconnaissance aircraft regained visual contact. At approximately 10 in the morning, 29 B-17 flying fortresses attacked from 5,000 feet. High-altitude bombing was predictably ineffective. The B-17s claimed hits, but Japanese records indicate minimal damage. One transport may have suffered slight damage. The attack served one purpose, though, forcing the convoy to alter course repeatedly, slowing progress toward Leh. Throughout March 2nd, additional B-17 strikes continued. The flying fortresses dropped dozens of bombs from various altitudes. Ships maneuvered frantically, and Japanese fighters engaged the bombers. Several B-17s sustained damage. 3 Japanese fighters were destroyed. But no ships sank. The high-altitude attacks were harassing the convoy, not stopping it. As night fell on March 2nd, Kenny understood the critical attack would commence the following morning. The modified B-25s were prepared. Major Lana had briefed his pilots repeatedly. They had rehearsed the attack profile on February 28th using combined formations of B-17, B-25, P-38, and Beaufighters. Every pilot understood the mission completely. Skip bombing technique had been practiced. Strafer guns had been harmonized. Ordnance had been loaded. The point of no return was approaching. At dawn on March 3rd, 1943, weather conditions were perfect for air attack. Clear skies, excellent visibility, calm seas. Rear Admiral Kimura must have felt profound dread. His convoy was approximately 30 miles from Leh, close enough for land-based anti-aircraft guns to provide some support, yet still vulnerable to air attack. The Allied strike force assembled at Cape Ward Hunt on Papua's northern coast. Approximately 90 Allied aircraft converged on the Japanese convoy, including B-17 flying fortresses, modified B-25 strafers, Royal Australian Air Force Beaufighters, and P-38 Lightning fighters for escort. Multiple waves would attack from different directions throughout the day. The attack commenced at approximately 10 in the morning. B-17s struck first from medium altitude, diverting attention and forcing ships to maneuver. Then low-altitude aircraft arrived. Beaufighters came in first, strafing with 4 20mm cannons and 6 machine guns, suppressing anti-aircraft fire. The destroyers opened fire with everything available, but the closing speed was too fast. Then the modified B-25 strafers arrived, and the slaughter commenced. Modified B-25 strafers participated in multiple attack waves throughout the morning. One pilot selected the transport Kyokusei Maru as his target and descended to 50 feet above the water. At 1,000 yards, he opened fire. 8 50 caliber machine guns, 6,800 rounds per minute combined rate of fire, 180 pounds of projectiles per second, tore into the transport. Tracers indicated where bullets were impacting. The fire walked from bow toward superstructure, shredding everything in its path. Sailors were cut down where they stood. Anti-aircraft positions were blown apart. The bridge disintegrated under the impacts. Metal fragments flew everywhere. Then he released his bombs. 2 500-pound general-purpose bombs with delayed fuses dropped away. They struck water 200 yards from the ship, skipped once, and slammed into the hull just below the waterline amidships. The pilot pulled up and banked away. Behind him, the bombs detonated. 2 massive underwater explosions ripped the bottom out of Kyokusei Maru. The transport lurched violently. Water poured into engine rooms and holds. The ship began settling immediately, listing to port. It sank within 15 minutes. Other modified B-25s followed in successive waves. Each selected a target. Each executed the same devastating attack profile. Guns blazing, bombs skipping, ships exploding. The transport Kembu Maru absorbed multiple hits. At least 3 B-25s attacked it. Combined gunfire killed most of the crew above decks. 4 bombs struck below the waterline. The ship broke in half and sank in less than 10 minutes. Teiyo Maru was strafed so heavily that fires erupted across the superstructure. 2 bombs opened the hull. The transport went down with nearly 1,000 troops still aboard. Nojima attempted to maneuver but was too slow. A B-25 strafer raked it from stern to bow, then placed 2 bombs into the engine room. The ship lost power and began taking on water. It would sink later in the day. Bowfighters and remaining B-25s attacked the destroyers. Destroyer Shirayuki, Admiral Kimura's flagship, was hit by strafing fire that killed almost everyone on the bridge, including Kimura, who was wounded. A bomb struck near the stern, igniting a magazine fire. Secondary explosions blew the stern section completely off. The destroyer sank. Tokitsukaze absorbed direct bomb hits that ignited fuel tanks. The destroyer became a floating inferno and sank within the hour. Arashio collided with the transport Nojima while maneuvering and suffered catastrophic damage. The destroyer was abandoned and sank. Throughout the attack, Japanese Zero fighters tried desperately to protect the convoy, but P-38 Lightnings engaged them at high altitude, while B-25s operated at masthead height, where fighters couldn't safely attack without hitting their own ships. The coordination was flawless. The attack lasted approximately 40 minutes. When Allied aircraft withdrew to rearm and refuel, the scene was apocalyptic. 4 transports were sinking or already sunk. 3 destroyers were gone. Remaining ships were scattered, some damaged, all in complete chaos. Hundreds of Japanese soldiers and sailors were in the water. Bodies floated among wreckage. Oil slicks burned. That afternoon, Allied aircraft returned for additional strikes. Modified B-25s found surviving ships limping toward Leh. The attacks were methodical and merciless. Each ship was targeted individually. Strafer B-25s approached low, guns blazing, bombs skipping. More transports sank. Destroyer Asashio, already damaged, absorbed more bombs and went under. By nightfall on March 3rd, all 8 transports and 4 of 8 destroyers had been sunk. Approximately 3,000 Japanese soldiers and sailors were dead or drowning. Another 2,700 would be rescued by the 4 surviving destroyers and submarines dispatched from Rabaul. Only about 1,200 troops would eventually reach Leh, many without weapons or equipment. Of the 6,900 troops originally embarked, more than 5,700 were casualties. The convoy had been annihilated. Allied losses were remarkably light. 1 B-17 Flying Fortress was shot down. 3 P-38 fighters were lost in combat. 13 aircrew were killed. Compared to Japanese losses, it was barely a skirmish. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea, as it became known, represented a turning point in the Pacific War. It demonstrated conclusively that land-based aircraft could obliterate a heavily escorted naval convoy. It proved skip bombing's effectiveness when combined with overwhelming forward firepower. It validated every modification Gunn had implemented on the B-25. Most critically, it convinced Japan that resupplying garrisons by sea in the Southwest Pacific was no longer viable. Never again would Japan attempt a major convoy to New Guinea. Japanese forces there would slowly starve and wither as supplies dwindled. General MacArthur issued a communiqué claiming 22 ships sunk, including 3 cruisers and 7 destroyers, and over 12,000 troops killed. Actual numbers were lower, but still devastating. The exaggerations were typical wartime propaganda. What mattered was the strategic impact. Kenny had proven his concepts worked. Skip bombing was viable. Modified bombers were effective. Low-altitude attacks could succeed despite heavy defences. Paul Gunn, monitoring reports from Australia, must have felt grim satisfaction. His modifications had destroyed a Japanese convoy. His aircraft had killed thousands of enemy troops. But his family remained in Santo Tomas, and the war continued. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea's success led to immediate expansion of the modification program. Kenny ordered all available B-25s in theatre converted to strafer configuration. Gunn worked even harder, training additional crews, refining techniques, increasing production. By mid-1943, most B-25s in the Southwest Pacific had been modified. North American Aviation, the manufacturer, took notice. Company representatives visited Gunn's workshops, examined the modifications, and requested detailed specifications. The company wanted to incorporate Gunn's innovations into factory production. Gunn was promoted to major and sent to the United States to work with North American Aviation at their Inglewood and Kansas City plants. He spent several months in 1943 and early 1944 working with engineers to design factory-produced Strafer versions of the B-25. The result was the B-25G, which mounted a 75mm cannon in the nose along with 450 caliber machine guns. 405 B-25s were built. The 75mm cannon fired a 14.7-pound shell capable of penetrating ship armor or destroying bunkers. But the cannon was difficult to load, required a crew member in the nose, and had a slow rate of fire. Gunn personally tested the B-25G in combat, leading a raid with the 3rd Attack Group against a Japanese destroyer. He struck the fire control system with the 75mm cannon, disabling the destroyer's ability to coordinate its guns. The ship was then sunk by conventional bombs. Gunn insisted publicly that he had sunk the destroyer with the cannon, but privately admitted conventional bombs finished the job. The B-25H followed the G model into production. 1,000 B-25Hs were built with the 75mm cannon and 1450 caliber machine guns arranged in various positions. The H model relocated the dorsal turret forward and eliminated the co-pilot position to save weight, with the navigator handling cannon loading. The massive firepower came at a cost. The B-25H was nose-heavy and difficult to control. Wright Field, the Army Air Force's development center, sent Gunn a message stating the modification was dangerous and aircraft should be grounded until the center of gravity issue was resolved. Legend claims Gunn replied, "Put center of gravity in storage for the duration. We have a war to fight." The story may be apocryphal, but it captured Gunn's attitude perfectly. Technical perfection mattered less than combat efficiency. Pilots learned to compensate for handling issues. The final production variant, the B-25J, reverted to a conventional bombardier nose on some aircraft while retaining the Strafer nose on others. 4,318 B-25JS were built, making it the most numerous variant. Some B-25Js were equipped with 8 forward-firing guns in the nose, 4 guns in cheek blisters, 2 guns in the dorsal turret, and additional guns elsewhere. Total armament could reach 1850 caliber machine guns, the most heavily armed bomber of World War II. The firepower was excessive in most situations, but it intimidated enemy forces psychologically. Japanese troops learned to fear the sound of Mitchell engines. The distinctive roar signified death was incoming. Throughout 1943 and 1944, modified B-25s devastated Japanese targets across the Pacific. In August 1943, B-25 strafers attacked Japanese airfields at Wewak in New Guinea. The raids destroyed 174 aircraft on the ground, breaking the back of Japanese air power in the region. The Wewak raids were possible because Gunn had solved another problem: range. B-25s had sufficient range for most missions, but Wewak was at the limit. Gunn developed a technique using auxiliary fuel tanks carried in the bomb bay. Once fuel was consumed, tanks were jettisoned through an opening in the floor. The system was crude, with fuel fumes permeating the fuselage and wind blowing through the aircraft, but it extended range by several hundred miles. The Wewak raids ended Japanese air superiority over New Guinea and allowed Allied ground forces to advance with minimal air opposition. In November 1943, B-25 strafers attacked Rabaul Harbour in one of the war's most spectacular raids. Major Raymond Wilkins led 38 B-25s against shipping in the heavily defended harbour. The attack occurred at masthead height, with P-38s providing top cover and phosphorus bombs creating smoke screens. Of 38 vessels in the harbour, 30 received direct hits. 1 heavy cruiser, 3 destroyers, and numerous transports and support ships were sunk or damaged. The raid paralyzed Rabaul as a forward base and demonstrated that even the strongest Japanese positions were vulnerable to modified B-25s. In the Philippines campaign of 1944, B-25 strafers provided close air support for ground forces, destroyed Japanese supply lines, and attacked shipping throughout the archipelago. The aircraft became known as Flying Death because attacks materialized so fast and low that defenders had no time to react. Gunn's modified B-25s weren't the only weapons winning the Pacific War, but they ranked among the most effective. They destroyed hundreds of ships, thousands of aircraft on the ground, and killed tens of thousands of enemy troops. They enabled MacArthur's island-hopping strategy by isolating Japanese garrisons from resupply. They provided Allied forces air superiority that made amphibious landings possible. Gunn's personal war continued throughout this period. His family remained imprisoned at Santo Tomas. Letters occasionally reached him through the Red Cross, but communication was sporadic and censored. He understood conditions in the camp were deteriorating. Japanese guards became harsher as the war turned against them. Food became scarce. Disease spread. Gunn could do nothing except fight harder, hoping each mission brought the war's end closer. In late 1944, American forces invaded Leyte in the Philippines. Gunn was there, still flying combat missions at age 45, still seeking ways to destroy the enemy more efficiently. On a night in late 1944, Japanese bombers attacked Tacloban airfield on Leyte. Gunn was on the ground when white phosphorus bombs exploded nearby. Fragments tore into his shoulder, causing massive damage. The wound was severe, rendering his right arm largely useless and causing excruciating pain. He was evacuated to Australia for treatment and would spend months recovering. The wound ended Gunn's combat flying, but his war was nearly finished anyway. On February 3, 1945, elements of the 1st Cavalry Division forming a flying column liberated Santo Tomas internment camp in Manila. The cavalry arrived just as Japanese guards were preparing to execute the camp's leadership. In the chaos of Manila's street fighting, American soldiers freed over 4,000 internees. Among them were Polly Gunn and her 4 children. They had survived 3 years and 14 days of internment. The family was emaciated, traumatized, but alive. General MacArthur personally visited the camp shortly after liberation and met the Gunn family. He arranged for them to be flown to Australia to reunite with Pappy Gunn. The reunion occurred weeks after liberation. The man who had departed Manila on Christmas Eve 1941 finally held his family again. Polly had kept the children together through impossible circumstances. The boys, now young men, had survived the separation of male and female quarters. The girls had endured years of deprivation. They were together again, but they were different people. The war had transformed them all. Gunn remained in the Army Air Force after recovering from his wounds. He was promoted to lieutenant colonel and continued working on aircraft modifications and tactical development, though no longer flying combat. He retired from military service on June 30, 1948, as a full colonel, medically retired due to his injuries. His decorations included the Distinguished Flying Cross with 1 oak leaf cluster indicating a second award, the Silver Star, the Legion of Merit, the Air Medal with 9 oak leaf clusters, the Purple Heart with 8 oak leaf clusters representing 9 separate occasions when he was wounded or injured in combat, and numerous unit citations and campaign ribbons. Gunn returned to the Philippines and re-established Philippine Airlines. The country was rebuilding from years of occupation and the destruction of liberation. Gunn helped restore air transportation, reconnecting islands that had been isolated. He was still flying, still taking risks, still pushing limits. On October 11, 1957, 7 days before his 58th birthday, Gunn was flying a charter flight when his aircraft encountered a severe storm. The plane crashed. Paul Irvin Pappy Gunn died doing what he had done for nearly 40 years, flying. He was buried at Barrancas National Cemetery at Naval Air Station Pensacola, where he had once been an instructor. His legacy manifested in multiple forms. The B-25 strafer modifications he pioneered remained standard throughout the war. Approximately 9,890 B-25 Mitchells were built, and thousands were configured as strafers based on Gunn's designs. The skip bombing technique he helped perfect destroyed hundreds of Japanese ships and contributed significantly to Allied victory in the Pacific. Gunn demonstrated that innovation could emerge from anywhere, even from unauthorized modifications made by a grieving father in a maintenance hangar. The official military bureaucracy wanted to fight World War II with existing weapons and approved tactics. Gunn proved that desperate circumstances demanded desperate innovations. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea became a case study in military academies worldwide. The combination of intelligence, coordination, new weapons, and new tactics achieved complete victory at minimal cost. It demonstrated what air power could accomplish against naval forces when properly employed. 8 transports destroyed, 4 destroyers sunk, over 5,000 casualties, all for the loss of 4 Allied aircraft. The mathematics were simple and brutal. Forces could not survive in environments where the enemy controlled the air. Every ship sunk in the Bismarck Sea represented dozens of missions that would never be flown, hundreds of troops who would never fight, thousands of ammunition rounds that would never be fired. Destroying supplies before they reached the battlefield was warfare's most efficient form. The modified B-25 became the weapon system that made this possible. It could range hundreds of miles to find ships, suppress their defenses with overwhelming firepower, destroy them with skip-bombing attacks, and return to base for another mission. One B-25 strafer could accomplish what previously required coordinated attacks by multiple aircraft types. Japan learned the lesson too late. After the Bismarck Sea disaster, Japanese commanders understood they could no longer move large convoys in daylight within range of Allied air bases. They switched to nighttime movements, used submarines for critical supplies, and increasingly relied on barge traffic that could hide in coastal waters during daylight. These measures reduced but didn't eliminate losses. B-25 strafers hunted barges with the same efficiency they hunted ships. Night-flying B-25s equipped with radar found convoys in darkness. There was no safe time, no safe method, no safe location for Japanese logistics in the Southwest Pacific. The stranglehold tightened month by month until Japanese garrisons were effectively isolated. In New Guinea, in the Philippines, throughout Pacific Islands, Japanese troops fought on with dwindling supplies and no hope of reinforcement. They were brave, tenacious, and doomed. Air superiority achieved by weapons like the modified B-25 rendered their courage irrelevant. By 1945, the modified B-25 had become the standard anti-shipping weapon in the Pacific. The aircraft evolved through B-25 G, H, and J variants, incorporating increasingly heavy armament. But the fundamental concept remained Gunn's original innovation: a medium bomber transformed into a flying gun platform that could suppress defenses and deliver devastating attacks at minimum altitude. When the war ended in August 1945, modified B-25s were still flying combat missions. They were among the aircraft that escorted the Japanese surrender delegation from Japan to Manila in mid-August. It was appropriate that aircraft that had done so much to defeat Japan would witness its surrender. Post-war analysis by both American and Japanese historians confirmed the significance of Gunn's innovations. Japanese naval officers stated that after the Battle of the Bismarck Sea, they understood they couldn't safely operate in waters within range of Allied air bases. The psychological impact equaled the physical destruction. Convoy commanders knew that low-flying bombers could appear without warning and destroy entire formations before defenses could respond. Modified B-25s had created a new warfare type where medium bombers hunted ships with submarine efficiency and cruiser firepower. The implications extended beyond the Pacific War. Post-war air forces worldwide studied skip bombing lessons and forward-firing armament. The gunship concept, an aircraft designed primarily for gun attack rather than bombing, became standard in many air forces. The AC-47, AC-119, and AC-130 gunships employed in Vietnam and subsequent conflicts were conceptual descendants of Gunn's modified B-25s. Of the 9,890 B-25s built during World War II, over 100 survive today, most in the United States. Many are maintained in flying condition, appearing at air shows where crowds marvel at their size, sound, and history. The distinctive roar of Wright R-2600 engines is unforgettable. The sight of a B-25 banking low over an airfield as they did over Japanese ships reminds observers of what these aircraft accomplished. Several flying B-25s are configured as strafers with forward-firing guns in the nose. When these guns are fired during demonstrations using blank ammunition, the sound is overwhelming. The muzzle blast is visible. The aircraft shudders from recoil. Watching a B-25 strafer demonstration provides viewers a glimpse of what Japanese sailors experienced in the final seconds before their ships were destroyed. Museums worldwide display B-25s in various configurations. The National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio, has multiple examples. The National Naval Aviation Museum in Pensacola, Florida, where Gunn once instructed, displays a B-25. The Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum preserves the history. Each aircraft tells the story of innovation, desperation, and victory. In 1959, General George Kenney published The Saga of Pappy Gunn, a biography of the man whose innovations had altered the war. Kenney, by then retired, wanted to ensure Gunn's contributions weren't forgotten. The book detailed Gunn's modifications, his combat missions, and